have all your questions answered. And for the sake of time, so I don't come in and out in the middle, they will just introduce themselves. Okay? Let's give it to you.
Does it work? Does the sound work or?
Works.
Oh, you can hear us? Okay, good. Sounds good. Thanks, Siri, for inviting me. Hello, everyone. My name is Shi. I'm a postdoc here with Doris. So for this workshop, we have been talking about like models or different part of the brain. So what happens if we bring them together in a shared space? So let's imagine that we're now in an unknown territory of the brain. We want to know what's going on there. So what would you do? Well, if you're Huber and Wiesel in the 60s, you'll probably just show parametric stimuli, and you'll record maybe a couple of neurons with tungsten electrode for each experiment. And maybe after a year, you'll have enough data to write a paper and to win the Nobel Prize. Okay. So time flies. Nowadays, with more advanced technique like neuropixel probe, we can simultaneously record it from maybe hundreds or even thousands of neurons, and this enables us to analyze the neural representation of maybe 2,000 objects. So, however, if we consider the complexity of the visual world, what we really can record it from is like a drop in the ocean. So how can we further accelerate scientific discovery? Okay. So one thing I think many neuroscientists, including me, have been dreaming about is to have, let's say, a computational model that perfectly resembles the brain, like a digital twin. So in this case, maybe one day we don't need to do that many bitter experiments. We can just work with those readouts to understand how different part of the brain with this model that encode those physical properties. Okay. So the way we think about this problem is inspired by the Platonic representation hypothesis. So even though like the visual foundation model and the brain, they develop in very, very different way, essentially they're learning from the same thing, which is our visual world. So if we're able to project these two systems together in a shared latent space, and then we're able to use foundation model together with a large scale of, let's say, unpaired visual data to learn a rich visual representation, and then we just use our small amounts of recording data that anchor our neural representation into this visual space. Okay? So if this works, we can predict neural response from visual stimuli. We can also decode the sensory input from neural response. But more importantly, we can basically use readout to study the functionality of the brain within this shared latent space. Okay? So since the brain is already very complicated and we know very little about it, so instead of like imposing some prior or some artificial label when training the model, we decide to let the data speak for themselves. Okay. So what we do, we have this encoder-decoder-like architecture. You don't need to pay attention to the detail. What you need to do is that you just need to know we have this independent visual encoder and neural decoder, a neural encoder that project both data into a common representation, a common format, and then we feed them to this shared encoder space, which align the two representations. At the end, we have very, very lightweight visual and neural decoder that project them back to the original space. Okay? So the model design doesn't matter too much. What's more important here is the way we learn it. Please forgive that hand drawing. So we have several objectives to learn this model. First, we start with single model reconstruction. For example, we start with visual, and then we project it to the shared latent space, and then we project it back to visual. Same thing applies for neural data. And secondly, we have this cross-model translation loss, where we start with visual data, we project it to the shared latent space, and then we use it to predict a neural response. But then we feed this neural response back to our neural encoder, and then to the shared latent space, and then use it to decode the visual response. So know that these two aforementioned laws, they do not require any pairing between the visual and neural data, so they can be trained with both paired and unpaired data. So at the end, we have this alignment loss, which basically operate on the shared data, the paired data, where we want the visual and neural representation in this shared latent space to be kind of close to each other for the same sample. Okay. So we work with electrophysiology data from recorded from non-human primate. For those of you who's not familiar with this, basically we put electrode in the brain and we record data from of different neurons, and then this is very high resolution. It can be up to like maybe 10 milliseconds. And then we evaluate model by generalizability to different directions. For generalization to stimulus, we study whether or not our model works for novel trial, novel images, or even novel object category, where the model, we don't have any training data for neural data for this. Okay? For the other direction, we study whether or not the model we train on one subject generalize to another subject of the same brain area, or whether or not it works across brain area. Okay. So the first question we ask is, okay, does this shared latent space enable like neural reconstruction of the stimuli? So for this, basically we take images from ImageNet, we project it to this shared latent space, and then we train a diffusion model that reconstructs the original pixel based on shared latent. We train the model from scratch without using any language pre-training or class conditioning. And then during testing, we directly feed the neural response to this shared latent space and use the diffusion model to reconstruct the pixel. Note that this is really a strong test because technically the diffusion model have never seen any neural data on its own. So does it work? Well, it works pretty well. So here we show some randomly selected example. For each pair, the left is ground truth, the right is reconstruction. It works for novel trial. It also works for novel images. And it's also very promising for this like novel object category where we don't have neural data for training. Okay. So this is great for one subject. Does it work for the other subject? Okay. So for this, we basically train like the shared latent and diffusion model from using data from one monkey. And then we just train a very lightweight, like a linear adapter that projects the data from monkey 2 to this shared latent space and test with the same diffusion model. It also works for all of these three scenarios. So this is quite promising. It shows that, okay, we can kind of visualize what's going on in the brain. But what it essentially tells us is that, okay, the visual information is there. So for neuroscientists, I believe we're more interested in like understanding the functionality of neuron or the brain. So can our method be useful in that case? Okay. So as a proof of concept, we first studied, okay, does our model support prediction of neural response based on visual stimuli? Okay, indeed it does. So here, if we can show that, we can see that like our model accurately capture those the tuning of those neurons for this like around 2,000 objects, and then our prediction has very high correlation with the ground truth, and this is true for novel images, novel category, same subject or across subject. So each dot there is for one example. Okay. So having this result in mind. Now we want to see, okay, does our method support in silico experiment, which is the dream we talked about at the beginning. So conventionally, for AFIS experiment, people will design this handcrafted set of stimuli of different object category, they call localizer. They will show it to the monkey before their real experiment because they want to know what's the selectivity of the neuron they're recorded from. So this process is kind of costly because you have to figure out all of those candidate objects, and also it reduces time you can do on your real experiment. So now we have our model. Instead of showing the monkey these images, these localizer images, we can just show a bunch of images to the model, and then we use it to predict the selectivity of a neuron that we recorded before. Okay. So here we show that like our model works by it's able to predict the selectivity of the neuron across 90 recording sections, and for selectivity of the faces, body, and object, they all have like kind of high correlation. Okay. Another thing we can do is that, okay, we can project a neural response from the brain to this shared latent space, and then we trace back to the visual space to see, okay, which part of the images to actually okay, question?
No, 2 minutes.
Oh, 2 minutes, okay. Activate the images. So we can see that this enables us to review the spatial tuning of neuron. We can see like face patch neurons are actually basically activated by like the faces, and body patch are more tuned to like body. Okay. So so far we have been talking about more of those like established brain area in IT cortex. So I want to go back to the question I asked at the beginning, which is, does our method work for understanding the uncharted territory of the brain? So our lab has been recording in some like interesting area in like prefrontal cortex, and we want to study what's going on there. Okay. So here we just train a linear adapter that projects the neural response from PFC to this shared latent space we learned with IT cortex, with IT data. Okay, and then we train a sparse autoencoder on top of the shared latent to kind of boost up the interpretability. And then here we can project the response from PFC neuron to the shared latent space and then to the sparse autoencoder, and we can find, okay, which of those sparse autoencoder features that are highly activated by PFC neuron. So here we show the top images that activate the same set of like SAE feature. You can see that they kind of suggest some sort of like images that involve social interaction. Okay. So if we analyze the activation of this SAE unit for those stimuli we recorded from, we can see they kind of form a cluster. From left to right, you can see like the first cluster, most of the activation, the SAE feature activate on it. In the middle one, some of them activate to it, and the right one, basically none of them are kind of responsive. So if you look at what's going on in those clusters, we can see that from left to right, there are kind of stimulus that involve animal interacting with you or each other, an animal doing something on their own, or something that, or image or stimuli that does not involve any interaction. If we label those stimuli, we can see a clear separation between the activation of this SAE unit for social versus non-social stimuli. Okay, note that this is only true for this like SAE unit activated by PFC, activated PFC neuron, but not for those like random SAE unit. Okay, I'll skip this just to make sure that we're not crazy. The model is not hallucinating. We also confirmed our result by doing an fMRI experiment on the same monkey and with a different set of stimuli. We showed that okay, the same brain area we recorded from, which is highlighted there, is truly selective. It's more selective to this like social scene that involve multiple agents compared to the other stimulus. Okay, very short summary. Basically, we show that like the visual foundation model can be useful for understanding the brain. We can learn a shared space between the model and the brain, and then this enables us to do encoding, decoding, but more importantly, it enables us to do a statistical experiment and also facilitate brain discovery. Okay. Do you have this? Oh, you have it. Okay.
Which one's
I'm not sure if I have time to take questions.
No, right now.
Sure.
But there is a coffee break, right?
Sure. It's okay. Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon. I'm Kaylene from TTIC, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about latent action world models. So throughout the workshop, and especially on Monday afternoon, we had a really nice discussion about what do we even mean by a world model, and what kinds of things does that include. So things like, does it need to operate over states? Does it need to include actions? Should it have some notion of like the dynamics of the environment? Should there be some notion of causality? In this talk, I'm not going to answer any of these questions, but I am going to try to maybe make some of them a little bit more concrete, especially in the context of robotics, which is most of what I work on. So specifically, I'm going to be talking about this paper that we recently put on arXiv. And a lot of this work was done by the lead author, Teddy, so lots of credit to him. And what this title is basically saying is that we are going to be trying to learn some continuous latent actions from raw observational data and put this into our world model for robotics. OK, so what do I mean by a world model in robotics? Well, in robotics, we're very interested in being able to do planning. So we want to have given some start state that we know our robot is in. We want to be able to figure out what kind of actions we should take to get to some kind of goal state. So in this case, the robot is kind of sliding this little handle slider over. And we want to know what should we do in order to be able to achieve this goal. And so this really suggests that we need an action condition world model, which is going to allow us to basically come up with some candidate sets of actions that we could take in this environment, and then imagine what the results of these actions might look like, so that we can then compare this imagined possible future with whatever our goal is, and use this to actually figure out what a good candidate set of actions is. And if you're familiar with something like MPC, we can actually repeat this process so that we don't have to do this zero shot. We can sort of refine our plan as we're learning more about how the environment actually responds to the actions that we're taking. And so in this case, the world model is going to take as inputs state and an action or a sequence of actions. And the output is going to be the predicted future state. And this definition is pretty natural when this is what you want to be able to do with your world model. OK, so this is all well and good. But we would also like to be able to take advantage of data where we don't know what the ground truth actions are. So typically, if we're training a function of states and actions to predict future states, we need to know what those actions are, right? We need to know what motor commands we should send to the robot to get to that next state. But this really leaves on the table a huge amount of data that is of humans doing all sorts of potentially useful tasks that we would like robots to do, where we don't know what the ground truth actions are that take these humans from one state to the next. But it seems intuitive that we might be able to infer this kind of information. So going back to the robotics case, you can imagine that if you take a pair of subsequent observations from our environment, so we have an observation at time t and an observation at time t+1, we should be able to kind of infer something about the kinds of actions that took us from O of t to O of t+1. Especially if we have like a huge set of data that has many kinds of these different transitions, where maybe we can kind of cluster together similar actions that seem to have similar consequences for the environment. And so in this case, we're training what we might call a latent action model to predict the action that takes you from state t to state t+1. But how do we know what to encode in this ZT? So just like a regular autoencoder, we could try to reconstruct the original observation. But here we want to do world modeling. So instead of just reconstructing the input, we want to predict the future observation. So what this looks like when we combine it with our world model is that we have our output action that has been inferred between these two sets of frames. And then the world model is going to only take in the first observation. And so now the world model can do what we said the world model was going to do. It's going to take in a state and an action, and then predict the future state that results from that action. But when we put all of this together like this, it looks like we should be able to just train this end to end. But if you look at this architecture for a few seconds, if you do a lot of ML training, you might realize that there's a problem with this. What is the problem? OK. The problem is that if we just train this end to end, then the model can basically cheat by taking the information in this future frame and encoding that directly into this thing that we wanted to be a latent action. And then the world model can just copy that into its prediction. And we haven't learned anything at all. Neither the world model doesn't learn anything about prediction, and the latent action model doesn't learn anything about actions. OK, so some previous works tried to do something that looks kind of like this. And they would tackle this problem of information leakage by maybe training in multiple stages, or trying to impose some restrictions on what the latent action model space looks like to try and prevent this from happening. But in this work, we decided to use a pretty simple trick to try to get around this problem instead that makes things pretty simple. So basically what this trick looks like is we have two sets of inputs that we're going to give to the world model. In the first copy, we're going to do the observation and the action just like before. But in the second copy, we're just going to give it this latent action. And in both cases, we're going to try to predict the future state. But in the second branch, if everything is working properly, you shouldn't be able to predict anything at all, right? You know nothing about the environment. All you know is that an action was taken. And so following this intuition, what we can do is apply the gradient from this branch basically in a reverse direction. So this is called a gradient reversal layer. And it's basically trying to remove any information in the action that's about the future state and not about the action that transitions you between these two states. So this is a really nice trick that allows us to just train both our latent action model and our world model together end to end, and hopefully disentangle our actions from our states. And so we have some pretty nice experimental results on a number of different domains that show that it does seem like we're doing a reasonable job of this. So this is an example of some robot manipulation task where on the top row here, you see a source video, OK? And there's a robot end effector here that's kind of pushing around some objects. And what we do is we start with a frame from a different setup. So we have a different set of objects. And we take the actions that were inferred from these transitions, and we run them through our world model to predict what we think will happen. And what you can see here is that, so first of all, just looking at the optical flow for the end effector, we would expect the motion for the end effector to look very similar between these two things if we have successfully disentangled the robot actions from properties of the environment. And what you can see here is that, in fact, these two rows do look very similar. If we instead look at the optical flow from the objects, you can see that they look very different. So the world model is successfully separating the action of the robot from the responses of the environment to that action, and actually making some pretty consistent predictions of what these different object positions would look like after doing this. So that's pretty cool. Another nice example of doing this kind of disentanglement is that you can take a pair of frames and then query for the nearest neighbor in this latent action representation space to find other similar transitions in some data set and see if you're actually doing a good job of taking away the action. And this is like a kind of like 2D Minecraft-like environment called Crafter. And I know this is too small to see the details, but what I want to point out here is that for our method, claw, many of these transition pairs, in addition to having the right kind of action, they also look very different from the query frame. So it's successfully finding actions that are being taken in totally different versions of the environment, whereas the baseline is overfitting and often like it's over-relying on this information about the state instead of disentangling that from the action. OK, so one of the things we talked about also was how to evaluate world models. One potentially very useful definition is just whether they're actually useful for the things we want to use them for. So we have some nice results of doing things like imitation learning from observations only without actions, and also doing planning in the learned world model, and showing that we can improve on the prior works by doing this kind of nice action disentanglement. But the very last thing I wanted to mention was that nowhere in this model did we ever introduce an idea of causality. We're learning purely on observational pairs of images. And this does lead to some kind of interesting, what you might call failure cases. So in this case, these are the source actions. And then this is what the model predicts will happen. So in this case, the agent is like right here on this little tile. And the action is to go up 1 square. That's what happens from this frame to this frame. But what happens is the agent can't walk on water in the game. So it can never go up in this situation. And so what happens is it just pretends that this was actually sand all along, so that the agent will be able to do this kind of movement. And so it's not really clear what the correct thing to predict is here, given the kind of information it's trained on. But I think this does raise questions about the limits of what we can learn in this kind of setup, and maybe like some kind of fundamental limitations of trying to push the limits of this kind of approach. I think there's been many interesting ideas in the workshop about how we could get beyond these limitations. I'm not going to say anything because I'm out of time, but yes.
Can you hear me well? Yeah? Yeah? No, that's just it.
Just start.
Okay. All right. Hi, I'm Gily, Ginosar. I'm a postdoc at NYU with Dan Sainz, David Schneider, and Alex Williams. And we are studying vocal communication in Mongolian gerbils. So here is a gerbil. Here you see a video that Dan Sainz took in Mongolia in their natural habitat last year, and you see a adolescent following an adult. So this is what it looks like in nature. So the gerbil, Mongolian gerbils, are a very social rodent. They live in multi-generational families, and they're active both above ground and underground in dark burrow and nest systems. And in the dark, if they want to interact with their families, they really need to vocalize, and they do a lot. They're very chatty, and they have a rich vocal repertoire. But we don't know how they use this vocal repertoire. And so being very social and being very chatty makes them a good animal model for the type of questions we're interested in, namely, how do vocal signals coordinate group behavior? And for that, I'm going to have to tell you what are the acoustic building blocks of this communication system. Can they be used in combination? And if so, what are the syntax rules, so to speak? And what are the messages that are being conveyed? And how many messages can be conveyed? And ultimately, not today, but ultimately we're interested in how are these messages encoded and decoded in the brain. So to study these kind of questions, we take the Big Brother approach, where we eavesdrop on groups of animals as they naturally communicate. So we built this large arena, complex arena, and in blue you can see the above ground setup, and then in red you can see the dark tunnel and nest mimicking what they have in nature. And we do continuous recording of both video, audio, and now also neural recording. So this is what it looks like. The top is the above ground and the bottom is the dark underground. We're recording from a family. It's always 2 parents and 4 pups. And we record them for weeks and just recording all the behaviors and what they're saying. So we have until now 5 families with over 1.5 million vocalizations. So as I said, gerbils use a rich vocal repertoire. Here are some examples of the type of calls that they're using. They're very distinct from each other, unlike some other rodents like mice. And I'll just play 2 examples. These are pitch shifted and also slowed down a little bit. This will be the test if the audio is working. Did you hear it? Yeah? Okay, I couldn't. And so this was warble, and this is stacks. You hear it?
Yeah.
I don't. Okay. But gerbils rarely use isolated calls. They use them in sequences and they use them in repetitions. And so I'm interested in the transitions between different calls. So here I'm plotting the distribution of intercall gap between all consecutive calls. This is from one family over weeks. And what we found is that there are 2, let's say, temporal regimes where the statistics of call transitions change. And for today, I'm going to ignore the long tail of this distribution. So I'll start with telling you about the slower transitions. These are hundreds of milliseconds up to 2 seconds. In these slower transitions, we see self-transitions. So the same call type will be followed by, a call type will be followed by the same call type. So look at the transition matrix. Warble will be followed by a warble, and high-frequency call will be followed by high-frequency call. Now, it's not exactly the same utterance. It's not exactly the same call. Look at the picture of the warbles. They change the shape, but it's the same call type. Let's hear it. So this was pitch shifted, but in real time. And you can see high frequency and stacks. So we call this homotypic bout, like the same call type. And the homotypic bout that I'm most interested in is alarm calls, because alarm calls in gerbils is a very cool signal. It's a multimodal signal. This is a vocal call, and this is a double foot drum that they do coupled to the vocal call. So this is what it looks like. Here is we see a father in this case in the nest, in the edge of the nest. He's facing outwards. That's usually the case. And his family members are already in the nest. He's here in the midst of doing an alarm bout over and over. Let's hear it. He's shouting. These are the loudest calls that we record. So this is not loop. This can continue for a very long time. The longest that we recorded was about 40 minutes when the family is already there. And so why are they foot drumming? We're not sure. But this is an interesting behavior for us because there's a behavioral proxy of the internal state of the animal. We know that it's now alarmed. And there's a clear behavioral response in the receiver. Did you see this? They hear an alarm. Someone is alarming, and they flee the nest. And we found, because we have this underground setup, we found that around 85% of alarm calls are actually emitted in the underground. So they run, and then they start alarming. So we see this kind of space-dependent vocalization. Okay, so you hear an alarm call, you flee the nest, and then if the alarm call continues to the sustained bout, homotypic bout, you have different behavioral options. You could stay put, stay in nest, because alarm is still on. You could join the alarm calling. Here, 3 of them are doing it together. Or you can go outside of the tunnel, look outside, and stand guard. This is a moving video, only the gerbil is not moving. he's like the others are alarming inside it. He's standing guard, looking outside. So this is interesting for us in the neural perspective because we have the same vocal signal, which might look the same in the auditory cortex, but different behavioral outputs, and we're looking like where in the brain is the message. All right, so in these kind of homotypic bouts, we're interested in what is the smallest information unit? Is it the individual call being repeated again and again, and if so, why? Or is it the bout itself? That's like the atomic package. Okay, I will now tell you about the very short transitions, immediate to up to 35 milliseconds. These fast transitions create combinational motifs. So these are what I call motiflets. Hear it? Oops. You heard it? Okay. So the fast transitions do what we call heterotypic transitions, so transitions between different call types. Here we see between a warble and stacks. That's interesting because we have the same call type here, warble, that could be either like in two types of different uses, either in fast transitions, which we found are usually emitted in the underground, or in these slow homotypic transitions emitted either in the underground or above ground. So same call type, different uses, a little bit like things we see in languages. Okay, last thing, these combinational motifs, we see them, we think, in contexts of competition. So on the left, we see gerbils competing for water. And on the right, we see pups competing for drinking from the mom. And now we're asking, are they using different sequences in these two scenarios? So for that, we use this kind of graphs where we're looking at the call types and different positions of motifs. So the first call is usually a warble. It could be half arc, it could be high frequency, but my point here is that it's not uniformly distributed. There's some rules about what could be the first call. The second call can no longer be warble. It's usually stacks, it could be half arc. Third call, fourth call, and fifth call. And what I want to say here is that there's some rules governing like the sequences they can make. So I want to say a sort of maybe syntax. So here is an example of a motif we see a lot, warble, half arc, stack. And here is an example of a motif we see less, arc, stack, but still within the like allowed combinations. So something like rules governing this. So to summarize, I showed you an animal model, the Mongolian gerbils, that exhibit both space-dependent communication. The same in alarm calls, the same call type can induce different behaviors. We see that the transition structure between calls varies with the temporal scale, and I want to say we see something like a syntax. We're now doing neural recording to clarify this more, together with Estelle Inzat. And I'd like to thank my advisors, Dan Sains, David Schneider, Alex Williams, the gerbils, and all of you. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tayler Bonnen. I'm currently a postdoc here at Berkeley in the computer science department. And the work I'm speaking with you about today is done in collaboration with Jitendra Malik and Anju Konozawa. Oh, there are no notes here. It might be useful to have those.
No notes.
To stay on time, Alyosha, I need notes.
All right.
Otherwise,
You need to work with the Vikram.
otherwise, it will definitely not be 10 minutes. And I think that you know this about me. Thank you.
Just extend display, maybe.
I can do a chalk talk if you'd like. Maybe we can do like some pantomime theater improv while we wait.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Talk about something.
So, understanding how people perceive the three-dimensional structure of the visual world has been an open question in the cognitive sciences for generations, hundreds of years, going back to Helmholtz. Trying to figure out how we go from two-dimensional visual inputs to a three-dimensional structured understanding of the world is a cognitive science question that we believe provides a foundation for understanding a lot of the ways that we interact with the world. However, we have not been able to, for many, many generations, formalize the theories that we have about human visual perception. For example, there are a lot of rich theories that relate to the conversations that we've been having here today about world models. People like Shepard and Metzler believed that in order to perceive the three-dimensional structure of the world, we have a rich internal model of the world that we are literally mentally rotating. So we're really good at inferring 3D structure from two-dimensional visual inputs. This is the kind of ability that works very well in practice, but not very well in theory. Because mathematically speaking, this inference is an ill-posed problem. There are many 3D worlds that could give rise to the same two-dimensional visual input, and yet humans are able to almost seamlessly infer what the underlying 3D structure is, even though that structure might not always exist. Understanding the computational principles that support this ability has been an open question in the cognitive sciences, again, as we were saying, for generations. Going back to, I still don't have my comments. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's fine. Who cares?
You
Who
can
cares? Who
do
cares?
this.
From Helmholtz to Marr, from Ullmann to Tar, there have been many theories that have emerged about how humans perceive the three-dimensional structure of objects. For example, Shepard and Metzler argued that this canonical reaction time dynamic revealed that humans rely on a rich internal structure of the world, something that we might call today something like a world model. And yet, evaluating these theories has been challenging in part because behavioral data are ambiguous, and we have not had good formal models to evaluate what we think is going on for humans. Deep neural networks in recent years have provided a computational framework that might help us formalize these theories. Over the past decade, we've seen extraordinary success trying to model neural responses in ventral temporal cortex. And given these successes in the neural data, it was largely assumed that we should be able to predict human 3D visual inferences. But I'm going to start here just by demonstrating that the classic vision encoders that we've been using basically fail catastrophically on the 3D shape inferences that we use in the cognitive sciences. The task looks something like this, where you have a single image of a single object. We then generate a new image of the same object, but from a different viewpoint, and then another image of another object. The task that we give to both humans and vision models is to identify which one of these is different from the others, that is to say, the oddity. And this gives us a nice formal way to compare both humans with other humans, and also humans and models. So we use this design to construct a benchmark of about 2,000 3D tasks with abstract shapes, familiar shapes, many different viewpoints. You can download this benchmark on Hugging Face if you're interested. And I'm going to just show you here, just really quickly, some preliminary or some summary of results. On the y-axis is human performance, where the y-axis here is going to go from chance to ceiling. And then I'm just going to show you the creme de la creme of the vision encoders that we all use today. Dynos, clips, multiple scales, MAEs, etc. And what you can see is that humans are just dramatically outperforming all of these models on this 3D perception task from the cognitive sciences.
Did you try dream sim?
Excuse me?
Did you try dream sim similarity?
Would love to talk to you about the many different versions of this that we've tried. The short answer is that until the thing I'm going to show you today, nothing has worked very well. And by very well, I mean at all. This leads us to a question. What kind of design principles might enable us to build models, to construct models that not only reflect what we know about the human brain and human cognition, but also that are able to achieve human-level 3D shape inferences? Oh, sorry. I think some of the most exciting ideas here are coming from developmental psychologists like Eleanor Gibson, like Linda Smith, and more recently, like Bria Long. What they have done has been to characterize the rich visual experiences, the sensory curricula that developing children have via headcam datasets, for example. And this has given us unprecedented insight into the visual experiences, the data that humans have. And it's also reminded us about the multimodal nature of sensory experiences for developing inference. For example, children are doing a lot of motion. And you might imagine that motion provides a strong auxiliary signal that might be useful for learning to see the world. Perhaps, not surprisingly, there's a novel class of neural networks that's emerged that learns from very similar kinds of visual spatial data. For example, I can take a video sequence such as this, pass it through a vision encoder like Dino, and using alternating self and global attention in a stacked way, we can predict spatial signals, for example, camera location, or something like depth for each of these frames. And we can train this kind of model using large-scale video data sets from using naturalistic scenes like the one I showed you here, or using synthetic data. And we're using a specific modeling approach developed by Wang et al. In 2025, VGGT. And the explicit purpose of this kind of modeling approach has been to try to model 3D perception with minimal inductive biases. To take all of the assumptions that we have about projective geometry and whatever else, and remove them from the model and try simply to learn about 3D data from the structure that the world gives us. How might we evaluate these models? Well, given a task like the ones that I've outlined for you, we can take these images and encode them pairwise into the model and extract model confidence, which is an internal metric that is used during training. And we can extract this confidence estimate not only for a single pair, but passing all pairs through. We can basically estimate, this is an aleatoric uncertainty estimate that's, again, useful during training, and we're just using as a readout at test time. And we can do this for all possible pairs. And visually, what you can see here is that when two images are of different objects, the model gives them very little confidence. When two images are of the same object, there's very high confidence in the model. And we can take this visualization and we can just reformat it into a number and run some numerical analyses, basically trying to take these average values and convert them into a decision. And so what we're doing here, effectively, is on one hand, we're taking the same images that human participants are shown. At test time, the model does not get cameras, the model does not get depth, the model only receives the visual information that humans receive. And we're generating a choice behavior that is effectively the same choice behavior that humans generate.
Meaning yes or no?
Meaning, yes or no, effectively, which one of these? Like a 1, 2, or 3.
Oh, I see.
But exactly, yes. And to emphasize, this is a zero-shot evaluation framework. There is no training or no fine-tuning after training on this large-scale visual spatial data sets. We are then testing on experimental data zero-shot. We are not training to predict human behavior. Showing you performance here. First, while humans are dramatically outperforming standard vision models on these tasks, as I previously showed you, these multi-view vision transformers are the first to match human accuracy on 3D perception tasks. This is a historic first, and we can go further. We can not only predict human accuracy, we can also, when model confidence is low, human accuracy is low. When model confidence is high, human accuracy is high, suggesting that the model predicts not only accuracy, but also the error patterns. And the thing that truly blew me away here, like, wow, was that if you take, and if you're clever, and you develop a measure of how much internal computation the model needs across layers in order to achieve the correct answer, and if you use that metric, solution layer, as a proxy for reaction time, you are able to beautifully predict human reaction time dynamics in these 3D perception tasks. If I've done my job right, if I've set this up and have not made mistakes because of not having my notes, when I show you this, you might be thinking about the canonical Shepard and Metzler data that I showed you at the beginning. Data that have been used to make grand claims about the nature of human cognition, and we can predict these theoretically meaningful measurements without ever training for human behavioral productivity. Zero shot. And so our work really provides an existence proof about what some of the design principles might be that are giving rise to human-level 3D shape inferences. I'm going to close quickly, less than a minute, I'm guessing, with the question that I opened with in the first slide. What computational principles support 3D shape perception in humans? I've shown you that a simple visual spatial correspondence learning objective is sufficient for human-level 3D shape inferences, and that you need not build in object-specific inductive biases into a model that achieves not only human-level 3D shape perception, but predicts error and reaction time dynamics. I've also shown you that reframing a problem which is ill-posed in image space by adding a multi-sensory objective enables us to solve this problem in a very nice way. And finally, related to this workshop, we can predict behaviors associated with mental rotation, associated with internal models, without having an explicit model of the world baked into the deep neural network that we're evaluating. With that, I'm going to note that we have our manuscript up on archive. The code and data have all been released, and looking forward to your questions if we have more than 1 second. Sorry for the technical issues.
No, that's fine. You don't need the notes.
But you, yeah, you got what you wanted, Alyosha.
Very good.
Great.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Eric. I'm coming to you from MIT, and today I'm going to be talking about perceiving physical objects with generative matter models. In a sense, this talk is actually dual to the talk that you just heard. We're very interested in looking at human perception, looking at what are the mechanisms that give us the ability to do 3D shape inferences from 2D, and taking those to controlled psychophysical studies and actually taking them back into state-of-the-art 3D computer vision. So human perception is a general purpose system that lets us see the full spectrum of the physical world. So on the left here, this is a stimulus from a lot of neuroscience studies. You'll see that there's an animal moving in the background, but the interesting thing here is even though there's an animal in the scene, the texture itself is stochastic and it flickers in and out as the giraffe moves. But also in settings such as driving in the rain or playing football, these are all view conditions, where you don't have full control over your ego motion, and also the actual stimulus of the world itself can be incredibly degraded. So what enables this robustness, right? Biological vision has some deep organizing principles. For a long time we've thought that vision looks something like take RGB video, extract the pixel level motion, extract the depth surface, and extract the appearance-based features, and then combine these things all into one single 3D scene representation. So this is good, and if you learn each of these big black arrows that I've just said, your system is going to do some things, but not all of them. And in that giraffe walker example I just showed, you don't have a depth surface, and you don't have appearance-based features, and yet, even if you have errors for each of these low-level features, your 3D perception is still stable. And your probabilistic inference tells us how to group cues that come from these different aspects of the scene. So human perception extracts mid-level information. Here, I'm showing you examples of videos on which there is no texture correspondence, there's no texture information that on any given frame that gives you any semantics of the scene. Yet humans are effortlessly able to extract segmentation, depth, and surface, right? If I were to, especially on these right examples, if I were to go in and I were to pause any frame, the texture is just dots. You would not actually see anything. And it's very much the correspondence at the texture level that gives you access to 3D shape. You can go even harder. So human 2D scene understanding and object inference works even when the object itself doesn't have a texture, and the object has texture that's completely stochastic, right? So here I'm showing you examples where, even worse than the giraffe, the dots flicker in and out very quickly. And yet, even here, when I'm going to show you some psychophysics results in a second, even in these extremely degraded view settings, Humans are able to pick out how many objects in the scene. There's usually more than one, and humans actually have graded confidence judgments about how likely they think they see certain objects in the scene. So these stimuli are hard, but to almost all people, our perception is very fast and efficient and accurate. Our visual system is remarkably robust, and we believe that this is enabled by probabilistic computation. So what does a computational mechanism look like? If you take a scene that has RGB and pixel-level motion, naively, you could just do two kinds of clustering, right? You can extract the objects from the scene by naively just running a clustering that gets out the particles, and then clustering the particles to get out the objects in the world. If you specify this as a hierarchical generative model, you can actually do this as two layers of probabilistic computation, right? For those of us who've been in computer vision for a while, this will look like you sample objects in the scene and have a forward generative model that generates the moving particles in the scene and then generates the actual RGB world and the motion of the things in the world. And then if you cast it this way, grouping is the inverse of this generative process. So if you can specify the forward direction, Bayesian statistics tells you all you need to know about actually doing the inverse things here in the hollow arrows. So to make this model video computable, we do a couple things. We take the RGB frames, we extract some depth and flow estimates, and then we use this to get a 3D scene extract, but that doesn't have any level of matter information and doesn't have any level of object information. And here, you can think about, we're not trying to do end-to-end generative modeling at the pixel level. That's something you would probably want to do with the video diffusion model. But if you can extract feed-forward features from your actual stimuli, you can get a representation from which you can actually do this generative modeling and inference. So these are incredibly difficult stimuli that on people, they have a hard time seeing what the object is. But our model, it picks out the moving 2D object here, even when the texture is incredibly stochastic. And one of the reasons we believe that people are actually doing this Bayesian inference is that we have a wide suite of stimuli that have different levels of difficulty. And actually, when we show people and we show our model these different stimuli with different grades of difficulty, we see that our model basically directly correlates with actual human performance. Certain stimuli that are hard, for example, where objects have incredibly subtle shear motion, actually being able to infer that there are two objects in the scene is difficult, and it requires you to do a lot of online computation. And we see that this is something that our model reflects, right? Even if you cast a probabilistic model, people at inference time have incredible compute limitations, and the accuracy of what they can tell you is subject to these computes. We also show that, on the actual 3D scenes that I opened with, humans can do structured motion from just a couple of frames. Our model, basically, this is incredibly out of distribution for any deep model, can online infer what the 3D shape is. But more interestingly, we compare it against two kind of deep learning baselines. If you just do the generative modeling and then use the generative model to do inference, the interesting thing here is that the structured probabilistic approach is slightly more accurate, but the real gain comes from a big increase in robustness, right? Here, our model is in red, and then FlowSAM, which is a version of SAM fine-tuned to work on optical flow, as well as SegAnyMo, a model recently that came out to do scene segmentation. It's not that, our mean is slightly better, but just like human vision, our model never just completely falls apart, right? When we see the visual world, very rarely do we have no idea what we're looking at, and very rarely does our belief about what's in the world just completely collapse. So human vision supports modeling physical objects, right? But they aren't always, we definitely don't typically look at these things in super controlled view settings. When we look at physical objects in the world, we can just directly do that modeling from RGB space. And here I'm showing you traces of our model when we give it the swirling wine or the moving fabric or the jello falling on the table. We can actually infer the particle system that makes up the world and the objects that make up the world that has the particles in it. So the same system that lets us solve the shape from motion in a camouflage 3D setting also, zero shot generalizes to naturalistic video. And naturalistic video has appearance information that provides a really powerful grouping cue. Like humans, our computational model sees the world in real time. So, we as humans, we constantly have to online process the visual stream of the data that we get. So humans take in this information as a stream, and from this stream, we directly build the 3D model of the world. It's desirable that our models can do this too, right? A lot of 3D computer vision methods can build 3D scene representations, but many fewer of the methods can do this online. So we want methods, just like biological vision, fast, robust, and general. And here I'm showing you two examples of our model being given a standard Davis video and in the process actually inferring the full particle representation of the world, right? This is something that you can equivalently get from a 3D version of code tracker or all of these point tracking systems that have been coming out in the computer vision literature, but also you get access to the actual objects in the world. And also the 3D points aren't just abstract dots on some 2D plane, they actually have some spatial data that they're explaining, and this enables robustness. So if you cast the world as having objects and matter, it both gives you the generality of explaining how people see remarkably quickly and remarkably robustly in these really hard view settings, but also it just generalizes to natural video, right? If I give you natural video, you can form the 3D particle system online. It runs at about 8 FPS. This is on par with our vision. This is fast enough that we can't really see that the model is lagging our own perception. And also, in one shot, the model gives us both the ability, because it is a generative model, it gives us access to rendering, so coarse rendering that you would need to use for some kind of downstream planning or some kind of decision-making task, but also coarse segmentation, right? If you have a 3D representation of the world that is actually segmented by identity, you can project this back down to 2D to get an actual segmentation map. So what are human-like computational principles, right? Why do we care about looking at human vision when we think about computer vision? Well, one of the things that buys us robustness is hierarchical modeling at different levels. And we've written all of this probabilistic sampling code on a GPU, right? A common, one of the questions I get when I talk about this work is, wow, we were doing this back in 2005. What has changed? Well, now, the same compute architectures that let us run deep nets in a feed-forward fashion let us program probabilistic inference also really quickly. And this hardware acceleration lets us revisit actually doing the probabilistic computation online in a human-like way. And I'd like to remind everyone that the reason that we kind of care about probability is not necessarily that we want to, online do statistical inference for every single small thing in the world. It's simply that it's a globally coherent specification that lets you look at the world. Hierarchical modeling lets you look at, condition out the big parts of the world, look at small local parts of the world, and use the local parts of the world to figure out the things that you care about. And this is a resource-rational way of allocating computation that our small and energy-efficient human minds are able to so robustly do in our natural world.
Yes.
Biological systems are all redundant. Maybe the first is to optimize it to be able to. No, if you go to
yeah, sure. Give me a minute. Okay. So I'm Max. I'm a postdoc at Columbia, and I'm going to talk about context-sensitive assemblies. So a fundamental question for neuroscience at large is this question of what does the cortex learn? It's commonly thought that based on its size, most of the part of the brain that is in the cerebellum, and its homogeneity, and that the circuits and cell compositions look pretty much the same anywhere in cortex. it has to be some kind of function that's generally useful. And so one hypothesis, motivated by this workshop, or perhaps by the same thing as this workshop, is that it's a causal model of the world. And okay, a more concrete proposal could be that it's something like a hidden Markov model of input that each circuit of neurons is implementing. So let me jump into our model. And the picture here is that we have a pool of recurrently connected neurons which are receiving external stimulation. And so what it would mean for this to be inferring the hidden states of a Markov model is that the input in the stimulus area represents the observations that are coming from this model. And then the activity in the recurrently connected pool would correspond to an inference about this hidden state. For our purposes, the connectivity everywhere is random and directed. Random meaning each synapse is present with a certain probability independent of everyone else. And then they have weights, which will turn out to be dynamic. The dynamics of the system are such that time is discrete and firing is binary, so each neuron has a firing variable, which is either 0 or 1. Neurons will compute their potential by summing their input from their firing neighbors. And remember, this is weighted, so if a neighbor fires, they sum that weighted edge. And then the sort of activation function is applied at the population level, and it's that only the neurons with the top k largest potential actually get to fire. And this is meant to be our approximation of local inhibition, a common motif in neuroscience. Now, like I said, weights are dynamic. And this is the dynamic is called the plasticity rule. So instantaneously, there's a Hebbian update, meaning every time that two neurons fire together, I increase the weight between them on the synapse by a little bit. And that's both if it's on adjacent time steps or on the same one. The more complicated piece is this time-delayed plasticity. So the way that works is whenever a neuron fires, all of its outgoing connections get a little flag, an eligibility trace. And this is persistent for several time steps. Later on, when a postsynaptic neuron fires, all of its synapses that have an eligibility trace, it adds them. And the rule here is that it has to burst fire, meaning 3 times in a row on subsequent discrete steps. On the other hand, when you burst fire, all of your synapses without a large eligibility trace get depressed by quite a bit. And so this process sort of keeps things normalized. Now let me talk about the phenomenology of this model. So the simplest example of this where we want to see context sensitivity is where I see a stimulus, but I see it in 2 different temporal contexts. And I want to encode the stimulus differently depending on those contexts. So here I'm calling A the one that's in multiple contexts and B and C the contexts. And what we get, first of all, well, let me explain what you're seeing here. So this is basically just a raster plot, meaning it's time on the x-axis and neurons on the y-axis, and I've sorted them so that they appear in clusters with who they fire with. And what you get is the formation of assemblies. These are like stable attractors that once they're on, they keep themselves on. And they sort of represent things, stimuli and contextual stimuli. So first of all, there's a nice discrete assembly for A, B, and C. So we can tell the difference. Great. What's more, though, is that there are actually distinct assemblies for A, depending on whether B fired before or C. And also, I should note that these assemblies, they're stable attractors, but they're not so stable that a change in the stimulus doesn't change. Like, it can shift between attractors, which is quite nice. And so the assembly that's firing for A actually depends on this temporal context. The story of how this forms during training, during seeing these contexts multiple times, is a little bit complicated to show, but it's very easy to explain. It's just that initially, the assemblies are just stimulus sensitive, and then after I see each context several times, they start to become context sensitive. And the number of times that we're talking about here is like 5 for each one. And that means that after I see B, initially one fires both after B and after C, but after I see each one a few times, a new one starts to form, which represents one of them, and then the old one continues to represent the other. A more complicated example is now where we have many of these transitions and they start to sort of form a real sequence of things that can happen continuously. So this is for a circular track where I'm going to see observations. Each observation, I'll stay at a location for a while, get the same observation several times in a row, and then I move to the next location and I get a new observation. And in this example, the locations on the track are not uniquely associated with observations. So if I wanted to read out where I am on the track, I would need to encode something deeper than the observation. And that's where we get this idea of contextual sensitivity. We also, during training, we remain at each location for an irregular amount of time. And also during inference, which makes this hard, you can't just learn a fixed cascade that doesn't necessarily attract. So assemblies are sort of intuitively the right answer to this problem. So this is an example of one lap along this track. And you can see that you get this stair step sort of, where at each location something fires, then you move to a new location, something completely different starts to fire, and actually every location gets something completely distinct, almost entirely disjoint from any other location. So this is sort of like a place cell receptive field for these assemblies, which is interesting. What's also surprising is that these assemblies are context sensitive enough to only respond to, I saw A before, not, something else. But they're invariant enough that on every lap through the circuit, I get the same things firing at the same position. So this is averaging over 10 laps. And you can see that there's very little deviation across laps. Finally, during training, it's the same story. It takes 10 laps to sort of fully fit this model. On the first lap, the assemblies are stimulus sensitive, and by the last lap, they've smoothed out into this nice stair step. So no longer block structure, but a clean cascade, which makes them location sensitive. And you may have to take my word for it, because it's a little bit hard to see here. Okay, finally, the most complicated version of this that we've tried so far is where the stimuli sequence is generated by a random walk on a grid. So your position on the grid determines what you see. You see it for several time steps in a row before you move to the next place. But some positions on the grid have mapped to the same observation. So this makes it complicated. Again, you have to use some temporal context, some memory, some history to figure out where you are. And the story here is a little less clean because we don't have assemblies for each location. But what we do have is a group of assemblies that uniquely represent the location. So here I just use these, the most basic possible template. Just run along this graph a bunch of times, average the responses at each location, and then when I get a new assembly, I just compare it to my average response and pick the most common one. And so you get 98% decoding accuracy with this, which is surprising. It is quite complicated because there's many different temporal contexts in which you can see each position, but it works. Yeah, so that's it for results. The challenges, there's many to go further. The first one is that this is really only picking assemblies that do a good job. During training, I only pick assemblies that do a good job of representing what I've seen. But really, you'd like them to also be predictive of what's going to come. And this is where we get better HMM learners. And we have some ideas about how you could use the eligibility traces and the quality of the prediction to do this, but it's work in progress. Practically also, the problem of perception might not require this kind of discrimination because perception is very rich, and so it might instead be a problem of just identifying when things are similar. And then finally, for the purposes of this workshop, maybe the interesting thing is what kind of model of my stimuli are you learning? But we're still in the phase of just understanding, what sorts of learners there are in this design space. And so thank you too for listening, and of course to my collaborator Christos Papadimitriou.
Fantastic. Thank you again to all the wonderful lightning speakers. And I'm sure you all have a lot of questions, so they will be available with coffee right outside. So we're going to take a coffee break until like